How do you go about doing this? How do I focus my ideas? It's important to start putting this in the context of the overall writing process. Remember, there are 5 steps to the academic writing process. Of course, before you start writing, you have the pre-writing process. If we look at this in comparison with the critical analytical framework that we covered, how to begin thinking critically, how to take a complex idea and begin dissecting it, that's part of the pre-writing process. Before you can begin to focus any idea whatsoever, you have to have a tangible idea based on the purpose of your assignment. You have to have something that's lucrative, something that will work, something that's debatable, something that's complex, something that's at a higher level. And once you have that idea, you have to explore that idea in some way. You have to understand what's going on with regards to that idea or concept. And so the entire point of the pre-writing process is not only to identify that idea, but to create a focus within that idea. In order to create that focus, you have to engage in the critical analytical framework. The very first step is to engage in that macro level of analysis that's a part of that framework, or the bird's eye view, again, if you will. Understanding the scope of the concept, understanding all of the necessary pieces, all of the necessary relationships, all of the components, whatever it is you're studying, it's going to require you to conduct some background research, to go out and explore that topic in some way so that you understand it from an overall or a bird's eye perspective. You have to have that perspective and adopt that perspective before you begin to engage in the micro level of analysis, where you begin to deconstruct that idea, if you will, and break it down so you can start looking at different variables, start looking at relationships, what elements of a situation are similar, what are some causes, what are some effects, trends, things of that nature. And so if we're looking at the prompt for this first contextual essay or analysis, I will call it contextual analysis essay. You'll hear me call it about 3 different things, but that's what I'm referring to as our first paper. You already have a prompt. So say, for instance, you are looking at the Church of Scientology prompt. You have an idea already. The very first step is to take a look at that idea. Should the Church of Scientology retain its tax-exempt status? That in itself I've already made somewhat narrow, while still allowing the flexibility to let you imbue that with a little bit more focus of your own, depending on your take of the situation. So you would take that idea, and then you would engage in the critical analytical framework. Step 1, macro level of analysis. Let's conduct some background research. Through in-class writing 5, you should have already taken a look at some content, whether it be online, whether it be, I know many of you all looked at the Scientology show that's on A&E, Leah Remini's show, which is a fabulous show, hence the prompt in itself. I watched that the night that I decided to put this as an assignment or a prompt, because it's so multifaceted and complex, and it can be observed or analyzed from many different perspectives. But anyway, you might be looking at some media content, some media coverage. You might be looking at some periodicals, some newspaper articles, or some media coverage scrutinizing the Church of Scientology. You may do a web search and look at some academic or scholarly religion-based articles, some psychology-based articles regarding the Church of Scientology and some of their tactics. There is a plethora of information out there, and it's up to you as an academic to conduct your own background research or to engage in your own macro level of analysis, to create a scope or to survey, if you will, to do a pulse check what this situation is, where it stands, where the conversation is, what is being said about it, both in popular culture, but maybe also academically. It depends on what you're looking at. So the Church of Scientology in this particular topic, this prompt would already tell us that there's going to be some government-based documentation out there. We might want to look at what does it take from a governmental perspective or from an IRS perspective for an organization to be tax exempt for religious purposes. We might realize that we need a baseline understanding of what that means before we can explore this topic any further. So that might be one take on it. That might be step one if you're looking at this level of analysis. Then you might, just to get a better understanding, take a look at some societal or popular media coverage that may be easier to understand in terms of breaking down, the IRS codes, what that means, and then also summarizing why the Church of Scientology is being scrutinized as it is. There are so many different ways you can do this. And then another take maybe you might want to extend this or extrapolate it more so into an academic realm and look at some academic journals that exist or some academic articles out there with professionals in the field, professors, psychologists, any number of specialists that are also using their expertise and filtering and analyzing this particular issue with Church of Scientology through their own discipline or through their own expertise or practice. That is, in essence, what it means to engage in macro level of analysis, is doing that pulse check, is doing that sweep through. While it's vague, while it's up to you to determine what method works best for you, it's always important to look at the topic and ask yourself, what do I need to know first? And then be strategic. Where do I need to look? Just in the example I just provided, I gave you 3 different ways, 3 different strategies that you would combine to conduct that background research to understand that topic better. But you own that process. And this is where you start developing your academic mind frame, is when you start allowing yourself, you start allowing yourself to develop that strategy for yourself. And that's how you start finding your center or your focus, if you will. So after you do that work, after you engage in that macro level of analysis, then you break or deconstruct that idea or that situation based on whatever it is into its subcomponents, into its individual elements. And that's how you are conceptualizing or how you are seeing that topic in your mind. This is how you focus your ideas. There are several tangible ways or practical ways, if you will, that you can do that. So in class writing 5, I asked you to write a simple contextual list. I gave you an example where you're breaking the prompt down into different elements as you see them, right? Because you own this process as an academic. And then what do? From that list, you have to organize those ideas. You have to ask yourself, are they too vague? What are the similarities? What are the differences? How do these things relate together? Then you can start grouping things by what's similar or things that make sense to you in your mind, cause and effect relationships. You can start pulling trends. You can start categorizing things. And then from there, you can further focus your ideas based on your topic. So some tangible ways to actually start visualizing this. Web mapping is one that's very popular. Sometimes these are called concept maps or bubble maps. This is where you take some of those ideas and plot them on paper. These are very rough versions of what a bubble map or a concept map looks like. But the idea is you start with a center bubble. This could be our prompt, for instance. Church of Scientology should not retain its tax-exempt status. You could put in this central bubble. And then from that context list from in-class writing 5, you can branch off of that bubble and begin to start listing your own claims for why they should not, based on your research, based on the background research and what you found. Reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. So for instance, this bubble may be illegal fiduciary practices or illegal money management, right? Well, what does that mean? when you say that, what does that mean? And then you branch off of that bubble and become more specific in terms of illegal fiduciary practices. On the same token, another side bubble over here may be organizational extortion or human extortion. But what does that mean in terms of Church of Scientology? Does that mean charging people overwhelming amounts of money to become a base level member of that organization? Does that mean employing people to work for your organization for scab wages? What does that mean based on the situation? But the idea is you start vague or broad and you get more and more narrow. And the idea is your starting points for your essay, main point A, B, and C in your essay, is likely going to be a bubble that's about 3 branches off of your main bubble, so a tertiary bubble. By the time you get to about this level of focus, this would be what would be an adequate main point for your essay out of the 3 that you would cover. This is also helpful just to see in your mind how you're grouping things. When you have a context list like we did in class writing 5, yes, we're a stream of consciousness listing items, but when you start grouping them and categorizing them, you can separate yourself from it a little bit and be able to objectively take a look at the similarities. You're seeing how your mind is naturally conceptualizing and grouping things together. And this will help you figure out how you want to order your ideas, or how do you want to take those elements you broke down and make sense of them in some way, how you can talk about the relationships of those items. And I'll show you what this means in relation to an actual piece of writing here in a moment. But this is what a bubble map looks like. Bring this back up. Another way to do this is a bulleted list. So for instance, you can take the context list that we created within class writing 5 and start with something broad, and then go to the next line on that list, make the idea more narrow, go to the next item on the list, make it more narrow. And so you're just creating a very stream of consciousness as the items are coming to your mind, as they become more and more narrow. You're creating words and you're just going down the list. That happens to work for some people. Some people prefer a visual, aesthetically intuitive type of bubble map instead of doing just a list. You can also do funneled free writing, where you are just simply writing about one of those elements in your context list. Maybe it's extortion. And you start writing about that. And then through writing stream of consciousness about that, you stumble upon or encroach on another idea that you never thought about until it became apparent in your writing. And as you started hashing these ideas out, then you take that idea, move it to its own page, and begin fleshing it out and begin making it more and more narrow. So the idea is there is no right or wrong. It's however this makes the most sense to you. But the one thing you can't do is start trying to develop a focus or generate a focus without engaging in the macro level of analysis. You have to understand the situation. You have to research the situation before you can break it down into tangible elements that make sense, and before you can become critical and analytical about those elements and those relationships.